Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Carl Zha returns to the show, and we did a follow-up discussion on the Hong Kong protests, which we had talked about last summer, episode 119. Then we had a longer, broad-ranging discussion on the rapid deterioration of U.S.-China relations, a new Cold War, the power structure in China, protectionism, globalism, Silicon Valley, the military intelligence complex, and more. There's a bonus question for patrons at the end about whether we are now in a new Cold War with China, the prospect of a hot war between the U.S. and China, and if that did happen, what would that war look like? Carl Zha is an engineer, an historian, a podcaster, and he's a Caltech alum. His competition and the history of empires, past and present. We recorded this on August 27th, 2020. Carl Zha is here, speaking to us from the beautiful Bali, which I'm jealous of. Hello, Carl. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's great to talk with you again.
Hi, Joanne. Thank you for inviting me back.
So about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, Carl and I did a long podcast on Hong Kong because the Hong Kong protests were really kind of peaking at that point in time. And it wasn't that easy to understand what was going on. And we did a broader discussion on Hong Kong and the surrounding areas. And it was a really good one. I linked it in the show notes for anyone who hasn't listened to that yet. It's there for you. And before we get into our main topic, which is U.S.-China relations, we thought we would do a little bit of an update on Hong Kong because, of course, time has passed and there's some more perspective. And it just seemed like a good idea to, catch up on what's happening there. Maybe things that were not apparent at the time are apparent now in hindsight. So what do you think, Carl? First of all, what's going on now in Hong Kong? And just, give us your thoughts on that, if you would.
Sure. So last time when we talked, that's when as you mentioned, the protests were really building up in momentum, and there were a lot of talks on social media, on Twitter, and of people making up wildly exaggerated scenario. Right? People were talking about a possible Tiananmen 2.0. And I talk about, I didn't think that was going to happen. I think most likely scenario is that China will remain hands-off and let the Hong Kong local government and the local police to handle the situation. But also China will probably use this opportunity to let the chaos continue and use that to gain support for eventual resolution, and that's essentially what happened because after the protest dragged on for a while, there was a lot of interruption to the daily lives of Hong Kongers. I even had a Hong Kong journalist reaching out to me on direct message on Twitter. And he told me that he is in broad support of the protest from the very beginning. But at that point, he became concerned, what the end game is, because he doesn't see like this escalating path of continuing violence, and he doesn't see the chaos coming to an end anytime soon. So, he obviously is not the only one that had been concerned, despite their sympathies with the protest movement. And what eventually happened is the passing of the national security law in Hong Kong. This is something that China had wanted to pass before. It was part of the was supposed to be part of the basic law, that the Hong Kong's mini constitution, but because a lot of opposition from Hong Kong, the national security law has been basically postponed indefinitely until this protest, and the protest I really gave the Chinese central government finally a chance to do it, and I think there are many reasons for this. For a long time, Hong Kong was the battlefront of the Cold War. In the 1950s, 60s, 70s, when most of China was closed off, Hong Kong was one of the main window for which China communicated with the outside world. Hong Kong was kind of almost a perfect battleground for the Cold War, because it's a place where East meets West. There's also, it was a British colony, so naturally it was very easy for various intelligence agencies of the West and U.S. to operate. And to a certain extent, China tolerated that even after the handover of Hong Kong, because, again, China needed Hong Kong to continue to function as a window to the outside world. And if that means to tolerate a certain level of U.S. Involvement on the ground, so be it. But what happened the last couple of years, what we have seen is there's a drastic cooling off in the relations between U.S. and China. I mean, we are entering a new period of Cold War right now, especially under the policies of Donald Trump administration. And, U.S. Has shown unequivocal support for the Hong Kong protests, including through the funding through the National Endowment of Democracy. And really, when China and U.S. finally is in a face-off in a Cold War situation, all the gray area kind of just fall away, including the operating, the freedom that some of the U.S. Organization like NED operating in Hong Kong. Part of the passing the national security law was China banning foreign fundings, right, to Hong Kong NGOs. Banning of especially NED fundings, right, and then immediately after that, Donald Trump announced suspension of the U.S. funding to Hong Kong, right, and that's significant. And also under national security law, they also have they can further crack down on the protests and to arrest the protest leaders, which they didn't quite have the framework to do before. They didn't have the legal framework to do before, and that's why one of the main financial backer of the Hong Kong protest, Jimmy Lai, who had been called the Rupert Murdoch of Asia by both Wall Street Journal and New York Times. He was one of the more public known figures who backed the Hong Kong protests, both with his own money and also in cooperation with U.S. He traveled to U.S. to have photo op with Pompeo, Pence, and so he was recently, as soon as the national security law was passed in Hong Kong, he was taken into custody. I think he's out on bail now, but that kind of put people on notice. Now the people who are behind the protests, they are liable to be arrested under the national security law. Is this, I kind of foreseen this happen last year as this happened, because as we talk about what China is going to do, obviously China would not want to have a Tiananmen 2.0. That would just be very bad for China's international image and its international relations. But what China did instead is to force some legal changes the legal changes that China had wanted all along, and now it was an opportunity to push it through, and this time without much opposition in the Hong Kong legislature because of the ongoing nature of the unrest.
Yeah, and we did talk about that. I mean, a year ago, we didn't have as much information as we have now, but there was a picture with one of the protest organizers with I forget if it was someone from the embassy or someone from NED, but I mean, anytime NED is involved, it's just the playbook is it's repeated so often that how can you not suspect that there's some type of regime change operation? I mean, there are different kinds, right? There's the R2P responsibility to protect the humanitarian uh, approach to it. There's the color revolution approach, which is what we seem to see in Hong Kong. And then we have, and I'm going to pronounce this, Xinjiang, uh, where the
Yes.
Uyghurs in, how do you pronounce that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, Xinjiang. The X is pronounced like a H, like
Right.
SH. Yeah.
SH, yeah. Xinjiang. Okay. In Xinjiang, it looks a little bit more like some of the quote moderate rebel strategies that we've seen in the Middle East, sort of create an armed insurgency and train fighters and things like that in a more of a longer term undermining or a setup for a future armed insurrection, something like that. In Taiwan, I don't really understand Taiwan, but there are clearly a number of different. I mean, big powers are always sort of planning against each other and plotting against each other. It seems, and um, but it seemed like this one looked like the color revolution strategy from the start for people who were familiar with the different tactics and the playbook that it changes over time as the world changes, but the underlying strategies always seem to be the same. But there seems like there's a factional war going on. And you mentioned, the Trump approach versus what we had seen in the past. To me, it looks like, tell me if I'm way off here or not, but there seems to be a factional war going on in the US, and it's probably not just Americans. It's now sort of the broader West and the other people are involved given the nature of the global economy and the security structure now. But there's some kind of battle going on, and it's about who our major enemies should be, who our top enemies should be, our strategic enemies. Something that we need to maintain some relationship with Russia to work against China. Others, based on what we know from the Clinton years forward, like the neoliberal establishment and some parts of the neocons and parts of Europe, they want to ally with China. And, maybe that's a geopolitical move, but there's also money involved, right? There are people who are heavily invested in China for some decades now. I don't know if things turned out the way they thought they would back in the 90s. It seems kind of like they haven't. Or at that point, they might have been just so craven. It was really, nation states didn't matter. It was just about making money. And then, of course, we have the defense industry, which is a huge factor. You have the people who are either genuinely concerned about the strength and the success of the U.S. military and NATO, and then people who are just feeding from the trough of the defense industry. And clearly, there's a desire to get back on a big spending Cold War footing rather than, these insurgent wars against insurgents in the Middle East, which no one likes. Um, they're not quite as long term. In some ways, the Cold War, there are still people around who see them as, the glory days. You don't have to fight actual wars. You still have giant budgets and you can do all this grand strategy and war
Yeah.
gaming and all that stuff. And I think they kind of, really like that. Um,
Yeah.
so, that's how it looks to me. But I don't know. Like I don't think that there's that big a gap between the factions. Um, but they have different strategies. Like it's been clear in South America, like let's say Venezuela, the Obama administration and before them, actually really just the Bush had a different tactic, but the Obama administration was taking more of a soft power, longer term strategy, sanctions, undermining um, Venezuela in a number of different ways. And then the Trump administration came in, and his backers were like, let's get this done. They just have a whole different approach. They're much more overt about the things that other administrations do in a quieter way. And so, but I really do have a hard time understanding what this push and pull about this new Cold War is all about. You got the China hawks and the China, they're not exactly sympathetic, but they're less hawkish toward China. You have rabid, xenophobic, again, Russophobic people pushing policies have been pretty successful lately. And I don't know, do they think that we need to ally with China against Russia? There's always this larger geopolitical, um, these goals and fears of a united Eurasia, of a Russia and China allied together, and maybe even Germany, which would be impossible for us to dominate or maybe even compete with. So um, I know that was kind of a jumbled mess, but that's because I am confused about the situation. I'm always interested in hearing other people's thoughts on, what is going on.
Okay, yeah, I think you are absolutely correct in naming there was some factional struggle within U.S. I mean, our government has been pretty dysfunctional for the last 4 years. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context for our listeners, because there's now a narrative in U.S. media, a popular narrative that's been pushed that the whole rationale of U.S.-China engagement for the last 40 years had been, it was a hope that through engagement, U.S. would be able to shape and change China's future, and for China to become a more open, democratic society. Because that approach failed, the approach actually made China stronger, and now the China's authoritarian model of government presents to a clear and present danger to the United States. That's why we must now reverse course. Now, that is the popular narrative that's been pushed in the media, but I just like to remind people the reason Nixon went to China in 1972 has nothing to do with democracy, have nothing to do with desire to change China. It was primarily driven by the Cold War rationale that U.S. needed to play the China card against Soviet Union. And in 1972, China was still in midst of the Cultural Revolution. I mean, compared to China today, 1972 China was a lot less freer. There's still a lot of crazy things going on inside China in terms of lack of freedom and human rights abuses. But that didn't matter in 1972 to Nixon or Henry Kissinger, who architected this rapprochement with China, because the overwhelming winning goal was to counter Soviet threat. And for um, for that lasted up to the end of the Cold War. And, China, U.S. and China really had a honeymoon period in the 1980s, where both sides cooperated actively against Soviet Union. China let U.S. know in advance before its war with Vietnam in 1979, and again, China cooperated with U.S. Against Soviet Union in war in Afghanistan. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, CIA were purchasing weapons from China in order to obscure the weapons' origin, I guess.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. This is during 1979. because U.S. still want to cover its tracks. I mean, even though everybody knows, CIA decided to purchase weapons from China because Chinese weapons at the time were mostly, the clone of the Soviet weapons. So they can be disguised as, not coming from United States. And also in 1979, a road between China and Pakistan was finished. That's a Karakoram highway linking the two countries. So, from Xinjiang right now, which is another trouble region, CIA were sourcing arms into Pakistan and to funnel into the Afghan Mujahideens. And there was actually a funny story about the mules because Afghanistan is a very hilly country with no very poor road network. So U.S. Decided to supply a lot of mules to the Afghan Mujahideens to carry their weapons. But initially, through the U.S. Kind of the procurement process, they supply a lot of Tennessee mules. But those Tennessee mules couldn't survive in the harsh climate of Afghanistan. Many of them started dying off. So in the end, U.S. purchased hundreds of thousands of mules from Xinjiang, next door, and have them shipped across to Pakistan through Karakoram Highway, and use these mules to carry on their backs, Chinese weapons for the Afghan Mujahideens. And this was actually well known inside China, and in the 1980s, CIA even maintained a listening station in Xinjiang in northwest China in order to spy on the Soviet nuclear tests in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. So in the 1980s, everything was hunky-dory until 1989 Tiananmen Square protest. That was a time when Berlin Wall was falling away, and a lot of the Eastern Europe are finally breaking free from the Soviet Union, and that was a time. It looks like China could be, part of that wave of going, the Communist Party could possibly be overthrown in the Tiananmen protest. So when that happened, the relationship chilled. But because the Soviet Union still existed, and that rationale for the Sino-U.S. Engagement, right after Tiananmen Square, George Bush sent a special envoy with his national security advisor, Brent Snowcroft, in a secret mission to China. And on board of the plane, one of my Caltech professors, James Lee, was part of that mission. He was on the flight because his father was a Chinese American physicist who was one of the earliest Chinese heritage to get the Nobel Prize in physics. So his father is very well known, and James Lee himself, he studied Chinese history, so he has a lot of contacts. So he was among the mission to Beijing in the immediate aftermath of 1989, and basically Bush went to reassure the Chinese leadership that everything will go on, despite all the noises in the Congress. Bush assured Deng Xiaoping he would do his best to make sure the relationship is on track. And then in the 90s, there was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, U.S. defense industry, the industrial military complex, in order to continually justify the huge amount of U.S. budget devoted to defense, they tried to hype up the China threat because now the Soviet Union was gone. This was a time when I came to the United States. I came to U.S. in 1990. I used to read a lot of these China threat articles in the U.S. media, and I thought it was pretty ridiculous because in 1990s, as you know, Joanne, because I think you have traveled to Hong Kong at that time, China was a very poor country still in the 1990s.
It was, yeah, that's what I saw. Yeah,
he was nowhere like close to matching the might of Soviet Union in the height of the Cold War. But that narrative was kept going. But there was a counter force in U.S. itself. There was two sides. There was a pro-engagement camp and there's a containment camp. So the the national security establishment, Pentagon, CIA, etc., wanted to contain China because they think, with the Cold War victory against Soviet Union, they can replicate the same successes against China because China was one of the last nominally communist country left remaining, and it looks like China could be the next to go. Whereas there was a pro-engagement side from the American business community. The China lobby in U.S. in the 1990s and 2000 are essentially the multinationals who wanted to go to China to exploit the vast pool of cheap labor. And also they salivate at the prospect of potential 1 billion Chinese consumer market. So they had a lot of incentive to go to China to make money. And many of them did. So there was a balance in the kind of in the U.S. China relations. There's always a tug of war. I remember back before WTO, China's entry to WTO, there was annual debate in U.S. Congress about extending whether to grant China most favorite trading nation status. And it was always a fight between both sides. But after the China's entry into WTO, which China made a lot of concessions to further open its market to welcome foreign direct investment, that debate went away because now, under WTO framework, China basically automatically gained the trade status with the U.S. And China's economy just took off, after the early 2000s. And that's something I think that was unforeseen in U.S. because by fast forward a few years into 2008, what we have here in the West was a great financial crisis, and coincided with that was the Beijing Olympics, which China planned to use as a coming out party to demonstrate how much progress China had made. And when all this when the Olympics was being to many American households, many Americans were surprised to find that China is surprisingly modern compared to their former imagination of China as a land of Mao suits and bicycles and straw hat peasants, right? And combined with that is when there was a sense America itself may be in decline. Because I don't think we really recover from the great financial recession because the stock market may have recovered, right? But the top 1% may have recovered. Amazon just made the headline. Jeff Bezos just became the first man to reach $200 billion in net wealth, but for vast majority of the Americans, that economic anxiety still remain from the great financial crisis, and that combined that fear is that China is going to eat our lunch, right? And I think that fear is what Donald Trump were able to capitalize on when he launched the trade war against China. Now, a couple of things change in the factional dynamic in U.S. itself as well, because as China itself move up the value chain, in the 1990s, China was manufacturing cheap toys and shoes, all the labor-intensive industries, and you move up to putting together Apple iPhones, right, for the American consumers. But eventually, China developed its own tech industry and it's moving up the value chain, right? Huawei started out as a clone of Cisco, and they expanded to develop their own technology base, and now they're one of the main. They hold most of the patents for 5G. Huawei was poised to build a 5G in most countries. And that's when the U.S. national security establishment freaked out because decades earlier, China had to rely on mostly American platform of 3G and 4G. At that time that was seen as a good thing, to make China dependent on US. Huawei had to purchase chips, Qualcomm chips designed in US by Qualcomm, and Huawei also relied on 3G, 4G network, which most American companies held patent to. So in a way, China was still very much dependent on US. But 5G is a game changer in the way that now Huawei own most of the intellectual properties of 5G, and on top of that, as we know through Snowden files, U.S. Three-letter intelligence office is very much embedded with all the tech companies in U.S. So NSA was reading our emails through Google. They even tried to force Apple to give them user data, and they work very closely with Facebook. What they realized with 5G is that if they allow Huawei to build the 5G in the Five Eye countries, that's US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, what they essentially have to do is open up the hood and let the Huawei look into the underlying infrastructure, which NSA and other U.S. intelligence agencies heavily embedded, and that prospect freaked them out because they didn't want to lose control. They could strong arm any American tech companies to comply with them, to provide informations on, say, individual U.S. citizens, but they don't have that kind of leverage with China, and that's why there was a strong drive to kill off the 5G deal with Huawei. That's pushed by the U.S. national security establishment, but at the same time, the pro-China side, the China lobby, on the business side, is starting to fall away because now China businesses have come to a point it became competitors for the American businesses. One of the thing about the latest TikTok ban is that Facebook was fully behind it because TikTok was eating away at the social media dominance of Facebook. And when the U.S. tech, the tech giant CEOs were called before Congress to testify whether basically China's present a clear present danger to spying in U.S. Other tech CEO kind of gave very ambiguous answers, but Mark Zuckerberg just said yes, and there was now it's even reported in U.S. media. Yes, Facebook was fully behind the TikTok ban. So now, kind of, it's like all the stars aligned for a new Cold War against China. Now the business community, which had previously been more pro-China, pro-engagement, now is shifting their tune to trying to kill off their Chinese competitors, and now also we have Donald Trump administration, which lack a lot of support in many ways in American society, and it's increasingly relying on U.S. military and Pentagon. So now Pentagon is also increasingly driving our foreign policy. So it's like a perfect storm. Now like be tough on China is almost a bipartisan issue, no matter whether you're Republican or Democrats. In this election, both Biden and Trump are trying to outdo each other to see who is more anti-China, who is more tougher on China. Right? It's also became part of American domestic politics. I think that also plays to the kind of the economic anxiety and the fear within U.S. that China is going to eclipse us and take over, eclipsing the U.S. hegemony in the world.
Yeah. Now, you just touched on about 4 of my questions, so I'm trying to decide which one to go after. I mean, these are all key issues. They're either key issues or they're indicators. They're clues to what the big problems are. Like with about 5G and Huawei. I mean, not only is American equipment with backdoors embedded in networks all over the world, and telecoms everywhere are, and like you said, even in China, are using this equipment because it was a new technology and that's, what they were able to do. But the other thing that occurred to me recently is that you could look at the intelligence collecting and all that as more covert, more a defensive measure or whatever. But there's also a lot of the military and the CIA, if you whatever the intelligence complex. It's also a strategic weapon, right? Because being able to go in and sabotage in other countries telecom, their communications networks, and both civilian and military. This is an ace in the hole. That we have seen, especially in the Middle East, over the last, I don't know, I want to say 5, 10 years. There were times when like a whole country's internet would go dark, let's say. So I think that's the other part of this that doesn't get talked about as much. It's just and it all ties back to the United States moving from a position of dominance to not being dominance, even though any rational person knew that that kind of dominance was not sustainable long term. But I do think the military is probably pushing hard on the Huawei issue because the way they've got all their networks set up right now is not only a way to collect intelligence, but it's also can be used as a weapon. And now, if put Huawei and involve China, the telecom business is very profitable. But it's also a strategic weapon for them. Does that make sense? I was just adding to what you said about the Huawei situation and telecom in general.
Yeah, I mean, there's also I just want to add to that. There's also a lot of projection from U.S. side. A lot of reporting about China. We talk about China as a surveillance state. I mean, there's some grain of truth to that. But at the same time, what we talk about China about, cameras everywhere. The supposedly the social credit system, and the government is snooping on data citizens. Those are the things that we do. The things we
Yeah.
do in US, and there's also a natural assumption. Of course, China is doing exactly what we're doing. And there are a lot of bogus stories being pushed in the media as well. There was a famous red chip scare that China supposedly built, put in some chips.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That was a big news for a while, and then a few months later, there was a debunking article saying, really, there's no evidence. The American companies involved, both Amazon, came out to deny it. But the debunking story didn't have a wider circulation as the sensational story of this Chinese red chip when they first came out. So there's a lot of it's almost a technique now in the U.S. Reporting about China, making up some crazy sensational claims that will go viral, and then several months there might be a correction or disclaimer, but which nobody really care about. But the mean of bad China is already seeped into people's consciousness.
Yeah, and where with the underlying assumption that we don't operate the same way, and that, yeah, like you said, we're just projecting what we do with some of our assets, assuming that China will. I actually don't think that's a bad assumption, but it is an interesting thing that plays out. But going back to TikTok too, you brought up TikTok. The and some of the changes that you noted are happening. So what does seem to be new is there does seem to be some panic in Silicon Valley, about losing their lead or their dominance. Again, it is not realistic to to think that you're going to dominate everything forever, but this attitude is just, I don't know, it's just become a thing here. So now And now that I know more about Silicon Valley than I did 20 years ago, and I personally think it has changed quite a bit, I find it hard to see where the intelligence complex, you might even say the military and intelligence complex, where that ends and Silicon Valley begins. I think they've just become more and more integrated. And I mean, I even question some of the legends about, guys in their garages, um, started these companies and then they just exploded because they were geniuses and all this. Like, I think that's more of a myth. Now we know more about
Yeah.
InQtel, the CIA venture capitalist funding. We've seen a military moving toward a tech dominated battlefield. Um, so I think that they did enjoy that just, once in more than a lifetime, once in a century opportunity that they had is coming to an end, kind of like the empire. And what they've done, and we've seen it certainly with local small companies who build software that, even if it looks like it might be a tiny threat, or sometimes it's an add-on, a third-party add-on to adds a feature that the Silicon Valley companies should have added on themselves. But instead of they just scoop them up. They're so big, they have so much money, they just buy up their competition or anything they feel like buying up. And they've been in that position for a long time. And now it's getting a little bit harder to do that. Um, and so it doesn't occur to them to, well, it seems to me, it doesn't occur to them to innovate and like really compete. They just think they can just
Yeah.
gobble up anything that is even a slight threat to them. Sometimes they pay outrageous amounts of money for things that you're like, you know, uh, that this company can't be worth. I forget, Instagram was one of those cases, although, it has been built out now and it's more valuable now than it was. But yeah, that is something that has changed since the 80s and the 90s, right?
Yeah.
And early 2000s. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the American but the American I mean right now I think there's a thinking especially in the national security establishment is that now we are at a limited window of of the continued US dominance, that we need to press our advantage now versus China rather than wait 5-10 years down the road when China will eclipse us. And the Trump's deputy national security advisor Matt Pottinger is actually on record of speaking about this. It's almost the idea of now or never. It's like if we're gonna screw China, this is our last chance. This is our last window to do it. Like in 5-10 years, China will just grow too big economically. It's just not feasible. And I think that's also behind the drive to so-called decouple the U.S.-China economy, because for a long time the two economy was highly complementary. The Chinese companies and American companies, they rely on each other to source parts, components, and technology. Like the U.S. still has overwhelming dominance in tech, right? Like in the software in the phone software industry, you either on Apple or you're either on Android. So it's either Apple or Google. You don't have other choice.
Yeah.
And when they're able to even entertain the ban of TikTok is because they can threaten to remove TikTok from the Apple Store and from Google Store, and then you will be gone, and TikTok will. That's one of the U.S. kind of enjoy the duopoly, right, in the platform. That's something which China really didn't build out its own capability, because for a long time the idea of free market capitalism is that we each focus on what we do best, right, and leverage the existing the comparative advantage. And that was all well and fine when U.S. and China relations were were hunky dory. You can make parts here, source it from there. Huawei buy Qualcomm chips. They make Chinese software companies make apps like TikTok that will live on American platform on Google or Apple, and that. But the whole idea of decoupling for the U.S. Defense for the U.S. military intelligence complex is that right now U.S. and China economy is too tightly intertwined. So the idea is that if we go in confrontation with China right now, you will hurt U.S. back, just because we're so tightly intertwined with China. So the idea is to do it preemptively, to decouple the two economies, to force the multinationals move their operations away from China to other destinations, so that give U.S. more leverage to start take a more confrontational approach with China, which I think is a totally crazy idea. But this is we're in the days where Pentagon is making our foreign policy right now, and so all these ideas are now being tested out as we speak.
Yeah, I actually don't think that's a crazy idea. I think it's going to be impossible to completely do it. But I am not a fan of the financialization of the United States and this idea that, we could just seek the cheapest labor, that, investors drive all policy in the end. Um, I think when you look at it from the perspective of the average citizen, the average American, I think it hurt this country a lot. And I also think that it's a really bad idea and it's just completely ridiculous and stupid to say that China is our number one threat and they're now at the top of the official threat list, and to also rely on that country for almost all of your goods, uh, not just things that are luxuries, but things that are necessities. I just think it's a much more for a more localization strategy, just for a healthy society, not only a healthy economy, a healthy society. I think that it was a craven move. I could look at this two ways. Industrialists will say they generally don't like wars, right? They disrupt their business, although sometimes they're all for going and grabbing resources in places, but in general, they want they think business relations is keeps the peace, right? Because two countries that are dependent on each other economically don't want to go to war because all of that falls apart. It becomes a real problem. But I think that so that's the positive way to look at it. But the other, I think, what drove the bringing China into the WTO, um, out, sending all the manufacturing over to China was just pure greed. I think it did not at all take into consideration the quality of life of the citizens of this country and other countries. So I can see the decoupling, you know, I don't think it's possible to completely decouple China from the United States, but I think the investors took over. I think that their greed was excessive to the point where it hurt average people so much that they just went overboard. We lost pretty much everything, and they went for the exploitation of the labor and all of that. Just that whole philosophy, this fake free market, because a real free market would allow labor to easily flow from one place to another to take advantage of the best market for itself. And the fact of the matter is that's just not, that goes against human nature. First of all, it's not easy, it's expensive, and it's against human nature. So um, I think decoupling to some extent and bringing more first of all, being able to be more self-sustaining is a really important thing for any defense strategy, and just for quality of life of any population. Just respect for your own population, not to just chase every last penny, regardless of how it impacts people. The service industry and the freelance, and it didn't turn out to be such a good deal for the workers. So, I come from a pro worker, several generations of this. So that kind of thinking it definitely has always influenced me through my whole life, but I've seen it play out in real time. And I think that less greed and less corruption, would be better for everybody. I don't think we can completely decouple, but I don't think it's absolutely crazy to reduce the amount of dependence on China or any country. It's not just China, any country in which we were in this kind of situation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's need to be a serious discussion to be had about globalization, which, by the way, is mostly pushed by the countries you lead, right? Without regard having too much public discussion about its potential impact on the working class of United States. And you're absolutely right, Joanne, that um, the globalization process in the last 30 years hasn't really you didn't really distribute its benefit evenly in US at all. All the most of the benefit went to the top 1%. All the workers get is, okay, they can purchase cheaper goods from China now, but they also were losing out on high paying manufacturing jobs that were inside this country before. And this is a problem of the global capitalism, right? I mean, the capital will always chase the cheapest labor, the cheapest cost, and that has been the ongoing process in US and led us to the state where right now, as you mentioned, an increasingly financialized economy, with all the wealth being concentrated towards the top, and the destruction of the middle class. These are very serious issues that US should have a very serious conversation about. But at the same time, we need to think about the rationale that was pushed right now by, especially from the U.S. military point of view, because they're not against globalization per se. They're against all the outsourcing going to China. So what the U.S. The military intelligence complex, they're okay with globalization as long as they're not being sourced from China, because from their perspective, it's putting all your supply chains in China constrain their own actions vis China.
I mean, that's
And,
crazy, right?
yeah,
That's
and
really crazy.
yes, exactly. And we should have a serious conversation about the impact of globalization and how we should move forward as a society. But that's not the kind of the conversation we're having right now, at least in the media. And this like U.S. in a way is still very a divided country, right? With a different interests, and most of the interest that was being pushed, all the need, our media is owned by oligarchs like Jeff Bezos, right? Like he owns Washington Post. So all the issues that in talk about in the mainstream media are the things that interest to them, and that's how Donald Trump was able to capitalize on the discontent felt by a lot of people by being left behind in this globalization process, and he leveraged that to his election victory, and to his own presidency. But that's and again, I think that's how the origin of the trade war versus China, he has a lot of support within U.S. for that reason. It's because there is recognition among many in U.S. that globalization is not working well for the common man in U.S. Right? That is a conversation absolutely should have. But what is driven the policy right now is is the interest in the U.S. Military industrial complex. For their own aims, they are pushing they're trying to drive. The multinationals to move their supply chains out of China, but those supply chains are not coming back to the U.S. We're not investing in infrastructure in this country. Instead, though, they're driving the supply chain to other countries, as a global South nation like Southeast Asia, to Vietnam, to Indonesia, where I'm in right now, to places like India. Again, it's repeating the pattern of chasing the lowest cost, right, and to get the maximum profit. That cycle, like the whole decoupling strategy pursued by the U.S. government right now, it's not against the globalization per se. It's against it's aiming toward to engineer a more conducive environment for Cold War versus China. So I think
Well,
that's what it's.
yeah, but here's the thing, China's still, like, first of all, I think everything gets simplified down to nation states, and that's not the real model that we're operating under right now, because you have, like you said, it's the concentration of, with such concentration of wealth and power, there are, relatively few individuals who have, outsized influence on everything. So, but China maintains, it seems to me, more of a nation state attitude, in that they're more protective. They want to be careful about how much of their property, their assets, get bought up by foreign entities. Because they're cautious. Like, that caution seems to have been thrown to the
Yeah.
wind here. Just a completely profit-driven thing, which is a suicidal strategy. The military, you know, a couple of decades ago, I worked in some defense industries, and I actually started my career in industrial engineering. So manufacturing and distribution, that was my thing. So I watched it firsthand just degrade and get packed off, and people's jobs get outsourced, all of that. Entire towns in Pennsylvania that sort of revolved around a small factory just dry up. There are parts of the United States you could drive through and they're just shuttered. So,
Yes.
This, I don't know how to make there was, so protectionism, we have ideologues who, talk about protectionism as bad or whatever, and whatever's good. But the truth of the matter is never, it's in the gray areas. Just
Yes.
logic, just logic. If you are concerned at all about the security of your own population, I'm not talking about crazy national security craziness. I'm talking about really just common sense security. You have to. You have to be at least a little bit protective. But we seem to have almost a whole generation now of business people and just Americans in general who are ready to accept the idea that, we don't do manufacturing anymore, that kind of thing. And to me, that is really worrying. It's really concerning. I don't want to get too tied up in this topic, but yeah, you're right. And one more thing on the globalism thing. That's another thing that I'm not quite sure how much understanding there is about the issue of globalism. It's been um, it's been like sectioned off into a fear of the globalists, as if they are a cabal of people who are plotting you know, to create a one world government and all this stuff. I don't see globalism that way. I see globalism as essentially extreme profit seeking and people who concentrated enough wealth and power again after about a almost a century now of them losing some of their power. And after the New Deal, let's say, they were very resentful of that, and they spent the next 60, 70 years chipping away at regulations about, any kind of protectionism, all regulation, any kind of social programs, this kind of thing, just for pure extreme profit seeking. And now they've concentrated enough, so they not got knocked down a peg, and now they've concentrated enough wealth and power, not a cabal, just the people who were able to, through ruthless measures, claw their way to the top and gather enough, concentrate enough wealth and power that they became one of the influencers in the world. And I think globalism is them just trying to, the nation state is inconvenient for them now. Um, they want global trade to be easier. They want to grease the skids. And I think that's really the root of globalism rather than some, Dr. Evil um, in a tower somewhere. I think people miss the multinational corporations and oligarchs or whatever you want to call them, the capitalist class, the top of the heap, the people in whose hands such wealth has been concentrated. I think that that's really what globalism is. I don't think they're looking for some magic one world government. I think they're just looking to tear down, you know, any resistance or any trouble that they have to go through to make more profits.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I think this also speaks to the difference between China and U.S. State. I think that you alluded to earlier, because in U.S., as we all well know, the the system is set up to serve business interests. If you have money in U.S., you can buy up news corporations. You can set up think tanks. You can influence policies. You can now we have people like Jeff Bezos, buying up newspapers, Washington Post. They dominate the public uh, 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 um, discussion, and they are the ones that, as you mentioned, to push this very extreme globalization that seek to maximize their own profit. This is the U.S. system, whereas China system is different, because the China's one party structure. You can be a billionaire in China. There are billionaires in China right now, but people like Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba Group, he does not get to set policy in China. He cannot, he cannot overrule Xi Jinping. He cannot put his agenda, like his own agenda is subjected to the overwhelming agenda of the Chinese state. The Chinese bureaucrats in the Communist Party, they have way more power over any individual Chinese businessman or Chinese billionaire. That's why we have the fugitive Chinese billionaire Guo Wenhui, who is making headlines recently in United States, working with financing Steve Bannon, right? and
Hmm.
and and that we don't have that extent of, we have a lot of fugitive billionaires from, say China or Russia. We don't have many fugitive billionaires from US. They don't have to flee. They make the system work for them.
Right,
um,
exactly.
and that's the difference between, the Chinese state and the US. As you mentioned, China could approach their restructuring of the economy in a very long-term fashion, just because they have a, single party state. They are in power for a long time, so they can actually plan out for long term. Whereas in U.S., everything is driven by the election cycle, right? I mean, like so your worry is really everything is short term. It's like the stock market. Everything is
Hmm.
driven by the closest news cycle, for the election. So there's no planning for long term, because long term, people know they will be out of the office. Who cares? That's why U.S. goes on these crazy, insane short term. I mean, it's just driven by a different incentive, right? The U.S. system. That's one of the flaw of the U.S. Liberal democracy. I mean, like Churchill said, democracy is crap except for everything else. So it need to be recognized. There are problems with there are some structural problems within the U.S. itself, its own political economy, and that's why, in a way, I think U.S. is becoming more and more like China, like you say, a more protectionism, more or instead of the old talk about free trade, because back then free trade was advantageous to the U.S. To the U.S. Business interest, because U.S. had overwhelming dominance, right? And then so it's good to talk about open trade about other countries opening up their borders. But now, in an age where U.S. is losing that dominance, U.S. is now putting in place more mechanism for protectionism. I mean, for good and bad, we can discuss.
Yeah, and there is good and bad.
Yeah,
there is good and bad.
Yeah, that can go down to a whole different rabbit hole. But that's I think that's one also the difference between the Chinese and U.S. State structure is also. I mean, that's also causing the fear, anxiety, right, in Americans and American policy planners, because they see this China as an almost unstoppable juggernaut, patiently planning for the long term, and whereas we're seeing the kind of all the dysfunctional domestic politics being playing out right now.
I mean, that's one thing I was going to ask you about. The power structure in China. As you say, the bureaucrats still have a lot more power than the billionaires. But personally, Chinese are still human beings. They have a different culture than we do, but they're still human. And I'm not quite sure how long that situation can hold. I think that's what we just saw going on in Russia over the last 20 years. The situation where the Russian oligarchs, if you will, they're never called oligarchs there, just here. I'm sorry, they're never called oligarchs here, only in other countries that we don't like. But we have oligarchs too. But they're pretty much, our government, it's pretty much a farce right now. It's just a front for their backers, and with, like I said, the concentration of wealth and power. Everyone's in on the financial game, if you will. Anyone who's in any kind of power. I think that kind of thing is bound to happen in China as well. Russia, that did happen during the fall, after the fall of the USSR, and then Putin came in. He reined in the billionaires a bit, or at least he picked winners and losers, and he left the ones alone who didn't mess with the state too much, for that same objective, to keep the bureaucrats and the elected officials so that they don't entirely lose control of everything, like has happened here. But I forget where I was going with that, but I wanted to ask you, is that really true? And do you think it's sustainable that China is still largely a nation state, controlled by the party and the bureaucrats in there? And do you think that long term they will be able to maintain that balance of power or imbalance of power?
Yeah, that's a big question, Joanne. The big difference between China and Russia is, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a total collapse of the Soviet era state-owned industry. It was all privatized, right? In the shock therapy that was proposed by Harvard-educated economist Jeffrey Sachs. And whereas China, the state still maintain overwhelming stakes in every part of the economy. I mean, what the Chinese did in the late 90s, 97, they sold off and privatized small and medium industries, but they retain what's called the pillar of uh, uh, the, the commanding heights of the economy, right? To use a Stalin's term, they the Chinese uh, Chinese in strategic Chinese industries like oil and gas, um, uh, like defense, they don't have different defense like private defense contractors competing for contracts, right? They're still state-owned um, defense industries. They're state-owned oil and gas industries. They're they're state-owned telecom companies like China Mobile and China Unicom, etc. And so that set China very differently from either Russia or United States. You know, in Russia, Putin have to play the oligarchs off against each other, right? And, giving favor to ones that's more supportive of him and getting rid of the ones who are making trouble. Whereas China can do that. You know, they don't even have to go through that indirect control. They control, the Chinese government control a large section of the economy still. They allow the proliferation of the private industries. Companies like TikTok, but they also maintain tight control over industry they consider important, like shipbuilding, right? I mean, and so China is in a way set up very differently from the United States. Jack Ma, right, the owner of Alibaba, he's the wealthiest man in China. But the Chinese government, they could just take away his company in a decree. That will probably spook off a lot of Chinese billionaires, but they could. I mean, they have been doing. Look at the fugitive Chinese billionaire Guo Wenhui, right? And that one of the reasons Xi Jinping has been billed like the next Mao is he's tightening party discipline in China, right? And he's kind of trying to get rid of a lot of the rot and the corruption that seeped in during his predecessors in the Zhang and Hu years in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so what I think is that China can keep doing this for quite a long time. I mean, Xi Jinping just basically made himself the leader for life. So at least for his lifetime, I don't think China is gonna change track, and I don't see like a tectonic shift within China to move away from that model, right?
Yeah.
And so as long as the Chinese state maintain control of these key economies, in fact, I think the whole war between China and U.S. will probably driven more Chinese state intervention in the economy itself, because another thing is we don't have industrial policies in the United States. We always talk about like state-directed economy as a very bad and toxic thing. Like in 1997, 98, when I was undergrad in Caltech, I remember writing a paper on kind of the state-led capitalism in East Asia, in models of basically Japan, Korea, that was later adopted by Taiwan and all the Asian tiger economies, and I suggested that's a model that China is obviously co-opting and adopting, and that's probably the way forward. But I was criticized by my professor because she was saying, "Oh, look, this was 1997. This was a time of Asian financial crisis." She's saying that model has been discredited. The only way forward is continued liberalization of the economy. The free market capitalism. This is still the decade of end of history. Fukuyama, right? So I had to rewrite my paper. Basically, I had to rewrite it to basically praise the privatization effort of Chinese state-owned enterprises in 1997 that was going on.
Amazing.
Yes. I mean, that's kind of ideological conditioning we experience in our own university campuses, Caltech, and what we see now, especially in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, maybe China got something right. At least they don't have billionaires running amok to controlling their government. Like right now, we essentially have the different oligarchs backing different sections in our own government. We have the Koch brothers on one side, we have the Soros on the other side, and it's just like they are just putting forth their own candidate, right? I mean, like it's the whole Sanders campaign was just so very disappointing. I mean, people are not really excited about Biden, right? The only
the understatement of the year.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing Biden has going for him is he's not Trump, right? Which is kind of what Hillary tried in 2016.
Yeah.
But this is the level. Yeah. So to make a long story short, I think. Oh, I accidentally hit the mute button. Sorry, I was gonna say I think China can keep going with its mode of governance going for a long time, because this is only the 70 years. It's only been 70 years since the founding of PRC. A lot of the institutional rot hasn't been baked in yet. hasn't. Well, I mean, it's there. But it hasn't because China is continuing to grow. So it's outgrowing a lot of the problems. At least it's covering up a lot of the institutional problems that's inherent in the system. The institutional rot is not built up to the point it will bring the system down. It's not like, unlike what we're seeing in the U.S. We are seeing kind of a lot of the fraying around the edges of the system, so to speak.
Well, that kind of. I've got like 6 questions or threads I like to pull on, but I'm going to have to ask you to do a follow-up interview soon, because this is really good stuff, and I'd love to talk to you some more about this, but I need to let you go. And so I'm going to, if it's okay with you, I'm going to roll into the bonus question now. Is that all right?
Yes.
So here's the big question, or the big topic that's on everyone's mind, either spoken or unspoken. You have a lot of people saying now that war with China is inevitable. So, I mean, others think that we're already in a new Cold War with China. So let's just go back to big picture on what are your thoughts on this? And if there was a war with China, what would it look like? I'm not so sure. It would look like previous wars. It may expand to a world war type level, but I doubt that it's going to be a traditional war. But I'm curious to hear what you think about that. The answer to the bonus question is in an extra bonus segment for patrons. So you can find that at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or at aroundtheempire.com. That's episode 179 extra, War Between US and China. So I'm not great at marketing. I don't like it. Not my forte. But I'm starting to provide more bonus material for patrons, as is necessary for independent media like this, funded only by listeners. And because I appreciate them, and they make it possible to pay the overhead costs of the show, compensate a little bit for the labor that goes into it. So that's my tease. I hope that some of you will subscribe to the podcast to get these kinds of extras. There's also full episodes for patrons only. We have a Discord channel for patrons now, And hopefully soon we will have some live stream sessions for patrons only where we do Q&A and discuss things among ourselves. So I've pushed my current equipment to the limit. So I need a new computer, a few other things before I can do that the way I'd like to do it. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap up. Anyway, there's so many other things I'd love to dig into with you, like India and China. There's so much I don't understand about China, Asia in general. The whole issue of India is almost a mystery to me as to what their position is. And so I hope that we can continue this conversation. I find it really useful. I don't think I'm alone in needing to understand more about Asia and China. So I hope we can continue the discussion.
Yes, that would be lovely.
All right. Well, Carl, please tell everybody, anything that you want to say, first of all, as we wrap up, and do tell everyone, how to find you, how to find your work, how to support you.
Okay, I would like to capitalize on this opportunity to do a little self-promotion because I do run a podcast, Silk and Steel Podcast, focus on everything about China, history, culture, politics. That's my 3 Balinese puppies are fighting. And I right now that's I'm basically supporting myself through the Patreon income for my Silk and Steel podcast that allow me to live in Bali. So I would appreciate it if people check it out and if they find it interesting and contribute. And I am very active on social media, especially on Twitter. So my handle is Carl Zha. That's Carl spelled with a C. And my last name ZHA, Zebra Henry Apple. So Carl Zha, one word. Or you can find me, search my name, Carl Zha, on Facebook. I also have a Silk and Steel podcast Facebook page where I share a lot of the news items and sometimes mean wars on the side of U.S. relations. So yeah, people are welcome to check it out. And thanks again, Joanne, for welcoming me for inviting me to your show, and we had such a fascinating conversation. I do look forward to coming back in the future to continue our discussion.
Yeah, and I'm going to link in the show notes. Carl's latest podcast is a conversation with a British guy who has lived in China for quite a while and did a biking trip through Xinjiang. And that's another topic that I was going to dig into a little, but it's probably its own episode or part of a larger episode because we don't know anything about Xinjiang. We as citizens, I'm sure our intelligence agencies and others know a lot about it, and some of just a little bit of a tease for maybe our next conversation is that the big story about the Uyghurs and the concentration camps, things like that, it looks like it's based on one shaky source, things like that, so we need to know more about that. That's a key region that a lot of people probably never even heard of before. But yeah, so listen to all of his episodes, but that one I just wanted to mention because I found it a topic particularly interesting. And thanks for that, Carl. I was really happy to see you doing that. I hope you do more on that region.
Yes, in fact, in 2018, when the first media report came out about alleged 1 million Uyghur in concentration camp, I did a 3-hour podcast on my older podcast, the Clash podcast, about the Xinjiang issue, where I could really delve in and in depth. But I think it's time due for update because it's been 2 years later. A lot have happened in Xinjiang, and I do want to give a update people with the latest happening in Xinjiang, what's actually happening on ground versus what's been reported in mainstream media.
Right. All right. Well, thanks again for taking the time to do this and doing the bonus question. It was great talking to you, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Joanne. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Carl Zha. Follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Zha, CarlZha. Subscribe to his podcast, Silk and Steel, and check out his previous podcast called Clash. Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and your support's really important. Please pitch in, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are lots of ways to find and to listen to this syndicated audio podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And hey, if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.